Adventure Time, and Steven Universe don't just feature trauma as plot points. They are fundamentally stories about worlds that cannot escape the gravitational pull of past violence. These aren't shows where trauma happens to characters. They're shows where trauma has already happened, catastrophically and irreversibly, before the first episode even begins. The Mushroom War destroyed human civilization approximately 1,000 years before Finn wakes up in the treehouse. The Gem War shattered Homeworld's colonization of Earth 6,000 years before Steven blows out his first birthday candles. Every character we meet, every conflict that unfolds, every moment of joy or connection exists in the long shadow of these wars. The land of Ooh and Beach City are both post-traumatic environments, and understanding this context is essential to understanding what these shows teach us about healing. The Mushroom War fundamentally restructured reality itself. When Simon Petrikov placed the crown on his head to protect Marceline, he was already living in a world that had chosen annihilation. We see glimpses of this pre-war world in Holly Jolly Secrets and I Remember You, fragments of a civilization that looks remarkably like our own. The implication is devastating. The apocalypse wasn't some alien invasion or natural disaster. Humanity destroyed itself. The mushroom cloud imagery that gives the war its name suggests nuclear holocaust. The mutagenic effects we see throughout, the bizarre hybrid creatures and candy people, and impossible physics, all stem from this moment of self-inflicted catastrophe. This wasn't trauma inflicted by an external enemy. This was suicide on a species level. The Gem War operated differently, but with equally totaling consequences. Homeworld's colonization of Earth was an existential threat. The cluster alone would have destroyed the entire planet. Rose Quartz's rebellion wasn't a political disagreement or territorial dispute. It was a fight for Earth's right to exist. But the methods Rose employed created their own traumatic legacy. She shattered countless gems, an act that within gem society represents a form of death. She lied to everyone, including her closest companions, about her true identity as Pink Diamond. She faked her own shattering, an act that traumatized not just Pink Diamond's fellow diamonds, but every gem who witnessed it or learned of it afterward. The corrupting light that the diamonds deployed in retaliation, an attack born from grief and rage at Rose's apparent death, transformed thousands of gems into mindless monsters. The war's end didn't bring peace. It brought corruption, bubbled gems, and 6,000 years of gems unable to return home. Both shows understand that post-traumatic environments don't just affect individuals. They restructure entire societies. In Ooh, the few remaining human settlements we encounter, like the human island in the Islands miniseries, are paranoid and isolated. They've built their entire civilization around never being hurt again, which means never taking risks, never exploring, never truly living. The founders literally erased their own memories to escape the pain of the Mushroom War, passing down only fear to their descendants. The humans of Ooh's Islands don't remember why they're afraid, but they've organized their entire society around that nameless dread. This is intergenerational trauma in its purest form, the transmission of fear without context, protection without understanding. Beach City exists in the shadow of gem imperialism. The crystal gems have been protecting Earth for millennia, but they've also been hiding on it, unable to return home, unable to contact other gems except in combat. When we first meet them, they're essentially a refugee cell conducting a holding action against corrupted gems, their own former comrades and enemies alike, while waiting for threats that may never come. Pearl's obsessive need for control, garnet's careful emotional regulation, amethyst's rebellious acting out. These aren't just personality traits. They're trauma responses to 6,000 years of being the last line of defense for a planet that doesn't even know it needed defending. Beach City's human population lives in ignorance of how close they came to not existing, of the colony that would have consumed their entire planet to produce more gems. The children born into these post-traumatic worlds carry unique burdens. Finn is explicitly the last human for most of the series, a status that transforms his entire identity into a memorial for an extinct species. He doesn't just represent humanity's potential future. He is the embodied memory of humanity's past. Every time someone in U calls him the human instead of using his name, they're reminding him that he's not just Finn. He's a category, a species, a historical moment. This kind of representative burden is enormously heavy for a child to carry. Finn doesn't get to just be a kid having adventures. Every choice he makes feels like it reflects on humanity itself. When he makes mistakes, he's not just a teenager, learning and growing. He's the last human making mistakes, potentially proving that humanity deserved its extinction. Stephen carries a different, but equally crushing representative burden. He's half human and half gem, the only being of his kind in the entire universe. But more than that, he is literally Rose Quartz's continuation. She gave up her form to create him, which means he exists in the space where she used to be. The crystal gems don't just see Stephen. They see Rose's legacy, Rose's choices, Rose's sacrifice. Every time they look at him, they're confronting their own grief and love for someone who no longer exists. Stephen doesn't get to develop his own identity separate from Rose's shadow. His very existence is an answer to the question, was Rose's sacrifice worth it? That's an impossible burden for a child to carry. The constant need to justify his own existence by being worth his mother's death. Both shows refuse the fantasy of clean breaks from traumatic pasts. In many children's cartoons, the backstory exists as setup, something that happened once and can be referenced for emotional weight but doesn't continuously shape the present. Adventure Time and Steven Universe reject this narrative convenience. The Mushroom War's effects are everywhere, constantly, in the twisted landscape and mutated creatures and magical weirdness. The Gem War's consequences keep erupting into the present through corrupted gems, Homeworld's return, the cluster, the diamond's arrival. The past isn't past. It's living, active, ongoing. Trauma doesn't stay in backstory. It permeates every present moment. This understanding reflects sophisticated trauma psychology. Post-traumatic stress disorder is characterized by intrusive memories, hypervigilance, and the collapse of temporal boundaries, the past invading the present without warning. Survivors of massive trauma often describe feeling that the traumatic event never really ended, that they're still living in it even years later. Both shows literalize this psychological truth. U exists in an eternal present that is actually the aftermath of the Mushroom War. Beach City exists in a fragile peace that is actually a pause in gem imperialism's expansion. The characters aren't recovering from trauma in some safe, post-traumatic space. They're still living inside the traumatic context, trying to build lives and meaning, while the forces that caused the original trauma remain active. The decision to set both shows in post-apocalyptic or post-war contexts, rather than showing us the wars themselves, is crucial. We don't need to see the Mushroom War's bombs falling or the exact moment the diamonds deployed the corrupting light. What we need to see, and what the shows provide, is how people live in the aftermath. How does a child grow up in a world that's already ended? How does someone build an identity when the foundations of civilization have been destroyed? How do you learn to trust, to love, to hope, when the evidence all around you suggests that trust, love, and hope led to catastrophe? These are the questions that matter for understanding trauma and healing. The wars that shaped both worlds also created the conditions for unusual family structures and unexpected connections. Finn is raised by Jake, an adoptive brother who is a magical dog. Stephen is raised by 3 aliens who are processing their grief for his mother. Neither show treats these arrangements as deficits to be overcome. Instead, they explore how trauma survivors often create chosen families, how people who've lost everything band together in new configurations. The crystal gems aren't Stephen's real family in any biological sense, but they are absolutely his real family in every sense that matters. Jake isn't Finn's real brother, but their bond is as genuine and deep as any biological sibling relationship. Both shows suggest that in the aftermath of massive trauma, rigid definitions of family and normal development might need to be reimagined. Ultimately, the post-war settings of both shows create a permanent tension between joy and sorrow, between building new things and mourning what was lost. Finn can have adventures and fall in love and eat pancakes with Jake, but he'll always be doing those things in the corpse of human civilization. Stephen can have birthday parties and play video games and hang out with friends, but he'll always be doing those things while wearing his mother's gem, standing where she used to stand. This isn't pessimistic. It's realistic about how trauma works. Healing doesn't mean the traumatic event disappears. It means learning to live fully even though the traumatic event happened and continues to shape your reality. Both shows begin by establishing that their worlds are fundamentally traumatic spaces. And then they ask, what does healing look like here? How do we live well in a world that's already been shattered? The answer unfolds across hundreds of episodes, and it's never simple, but it starts with this understanding that trauma isn't just something that happens to individuals. It reshapes entire worlds, and healing has to account for that totality. Neither Finn nor Stephen fought in the wars that define their worlds, yet both carry those wars inside them. This is the cruel mathematics of intergenerational trauma, the emotional and psychological wounds that pass from one generation to the next, often intensifying rather than diminishing with time. Children inherit not just their parents' genes and cultural traditions, but their unprocessed pain, their coping mechanisms, their fears, and their silences. Finn inherited a dead civilization. Stephen inherited a lie. Understanding how they navigate these inherited burdens reveals profound truths about how trauma echoes through generations and what it takes to break those echoes. Finn's discovery that he's the last human happens gradually and devastatingly across the series. In early episodes, his humanity seems like a character trait, a bit of world building that makes him unique in Ooh. But Susan Strong begins interrogating what this uniqueness means. When Finn meets the humans, mutated humans living underground, his desperate hope that he's found his people collides with the reality that they're not quite human anymore, or perhaps they're differently human. Susan's ambiguous status, the fish-like features that might be mutations or might be accessories, Finn's inability to determine whether she's truly human, this uncertainty is its own form of trauma. Finn wants so badly to not be alone that he's willing to accept ambiguous evidence, but the ambiguity itself wounds him. The revelation in the vault that Finn has past lives, including one as Shoko, a young woman who died working for the Bath Boy gang, adds layers to his inherited trauma. He's not just the last human in this life. He's a soul that has experienced loss and betrayal across multiple incarnations. When Finn remembers Shoko's death, remembers betraying Princess Bubblegum in a past life, he's accessing trauma that predates his current existence. This metaphysical dimension suggests that trauma can transcend individual lifetimes, that the wounds we carry might be deeper and older than our conscious memories. It's a fantastical literalization of how trauma actually works psychologically. We carry wounds we don't remember receiving, fears that seem to have no origin, patterns we didn't consciously learn. The Islands miniseries makes Finn's inherited trauma explicit and unavoidable. When Finn discovers the human islands and meets his mother Minerva, he's forced to confront exactly what he inherited. Minerva is a helper, someone whose trauma response to the Mushroom War was to dedicate herself completely to protecting and healing others. She became a doctor, then uploaded her consciousness to help people even after her body was injured. But her help is controlling and totalizing. She literally cannot allow people to take risks or make choices that might hurt them. The Island Society, founded by Minerva's generation, is a trauma response calcified into dystopia. They erased their own memories of the Mushroom War and built a society around total safety, which means total stagnation. Finn inherited Minerva's trauma, not through conscious teaching, but through absence. Martin, Finn's father, is a catastrophically damaged person who responds to trauma through avoidance and detachment. He literally fled his family when danger approached, leaving infant Finn to drift away on a raft. When Finn finally meets Martin in Escape from the Citadel, hoping for some explanation or redemption, Martin is casually cruel in his disinterest. He doesn't hate Finn, he just doesn't feel anything about him. This emotional abandonment is its own form of inherited trauma. Finn learned that fathers leave, that protection isn't guaranteed, that he's fundamentally on his own. He internalized these lessons before he had language to describe them. The psychological concept of attachment theory helps clarify what Finn inherited. Children develop internal working models of relationships based on their earliest experiences with caregivers. Secure attachment comes from consistent, responsive caregiving, but Finn's earliest caregivers were absent. Martin through abandonment, Minerva through circumstances beyond her control. Jake and his parents provided love and care, but Finn always knew he was adopted, always knew he was different. This creates what's called anxious or disorganized attachment, a persistent uncertainty about whether others will be there when needed, a hypervigilance about relationship stability, a tendency to either cling too tightly or push away preemptively. We see this attachment pattern play out in Finn's romantic relationships. His obsessive pursuit of Princess Bubblegum, his devastation when she rejects him, his subsequent chaotic relationship with Flame Princess, where he accidentally manipulates her emotions. These aren't just teenage romantic mistakes, they're trauma reenactments. Finn is trying to create the secure connection he never had with his parents, but his internal template for relationships is based on abandonment and loss. He doesn't know how to be in relationship without fear of imminent abandonment, so he creates the conditions for abandonment through his own actions. When Flame Princess discovers he's been staging fights for her, she breaks up with him, confirming Finn's deepest fear that he's unworthy of consistent love. Stephen's inherited trauma operates through different mechanisms, but with similar depth. He never knew Rose Quartz directly, but her presence permeates every aspect of his life. The crystal gems each relate to Stephen through their relationship with Rose. Pearl's devotion to Rose borders on worship. She built her entire identity around being Rose's confidant and knight. When Pearl looks at Stephen, she sees both the child she's sworn to protect and the woman she loved, who chose to stop existing. Garnet respects Rose's choice to become Stephen, but she also knows secrets about Rose that complicate that respect. Amethyst has the least complicated relationship with Rose, but she still processes Stephen through the lens of Rose's legacy. The lie at the center of Stephen's inherited trauma is revealed slowly across the series. Rose wasn't a Quartz soldier who rebelled against Homeworld. She was Pink Diamond, one of the matriarchs she claimed to fight against. She faked her own shattering, deceiving not just her enemies, but her closest friends. She started a war that corrupted thousands of gems, shattered countless others, and traumatized her fellow diamonds, all based on a lie. When Stephen learns this truth, it shatters his understanding of himself. His mother wasn't a hero who died fighting tyranny. She was a complicated person who made catastrophic choices that she never fully answered for because she stopped existing before facing consequences. This is a particularly cruel form of inherited trauma, inheriting not just wounds, but responsibilities for actions you didn't commit. Stephen doesn't just carry Rose's legacy of heroism, he carries her legacy of deception, of unfinished business with the diamonds, of corrupted gems who don't know that the rebel leader who fought them was actually one of their own leaders. Stephen spends the entire series cleaning up Rose's messes, literally and metaphorically. He has to unbubble the gems she bubbled. He has to heal the corrupted gems her war created. He has to face the diamonds, whose grief and rage at Pink's false death motivated their most destructive acts. He has to do all of this while grappling with the fact that his existence is the direct result of Rose's choice to abandon all of these responsibilities. The intergenerational transmission of trauma often involves what psychologists call the conspiracy of silence, the things families don't talk about, the secrets that everyone knows but no one names. Rose left Stephen the ultimate silence. She gave up her form without explaining who she really was, without preparing the crystal gems for the truth, without leaving instructions for how to handle the inevitable moment when her past caught up with them. Pearl literally couldn't talk about Pink Diamond due to the order Rose gave her. Stephen inherits not just Rose's problems, but her silences, her evasions, her refusal to fully confront what she'd done. Both Finn and Stephen demonstrate what psychologists call enmeshed identity, the difficulty of separating their own sense of self from the identities imposed on them by inherited trauma. Finn struggles to distinguish between what he wants and what humanity needs from its last representative. Does he want to be a hero, or does he feel obligated to be heroic because he's the human? Does he genuinely love Princess Bubblegum, or is he trying to ensure humanity's genetic legacy by pursuing the smartest, most powerful person available? These questions haunt Finn throughout the series because he cannot easily separate his individual desires from his inherited role. Stephen's enmeshment with Rose goes even deeper because he literally has her gem. He doesn't just inherit her legacy, he inherits her physical form, her powers, her place in gem society. When other gems look at him, many see Rose Quartz first and Stephen second. This confusion isn't just symbolic. Stephen can access Rose's memories through his dreams, can use her room that manifests desires, carries her shield and healing powers. Where does Rose end and Stephen begin? This question becomes increasingly urgent as Stephen realizes that Rose's choices continue to determine his present. He doesn't just have a complicated mother. He has his mother's life, continuing through his body. The trauma of inherited responsibility becomes explicit when Stephen faces the diamonds. He's expected to answer for Rose's choices, to explain why she did what she did, to somehow make things right. But Stephen doesn't have those answers. He didn't make those choices. He can't explain Rose's motivations because she never explained them. Yet the diamonds, particularly blue and yellow diamond, hold Stephen accountable, as if he and Rose are the same person. This is vicarious traumatization in its most literal form, being punished for someone else's actions because you're seen as their continuation. Both shows explore how inherited trauma creates impossible double binds. Finn is expected to preserve and represent humanity, but there's no human culture left to preserve, no human community to represent. He's supposed to be the human, but what does that mean in Ooh, where humans are extinct? He invents his heroism, his moral code, his entire identity from scratch, but it's always shadowed by the sense that he should know these things, that real humans had answers he's missing. Stephen is expected to have Rose's wisdom, her power, her certainty, but he's just a kid trying to figure out how to be himself. He's supposed to live up to Rose's legend, while also correcting her mistakes, an impossible task that generates constant anxiety. The healing from inherited trauma, which both shows explore extensively, begins with the recognition that you are not responsible for the trauma you inherited. Finn didn't cause the Mushroom War. Stephen didn't fake pink diamonds shattering or start the Gem War. But both initially accept responsibility for these inherited burdens, because that's what intergenerational trauma does. It convinces children that they must somehow fix what their parents broke. The journey toward healing involves the painful process of separating what's yours to carry from what you've been handed unfairly. It means acknowledging the inheritance without being defined by it, honoring the past without being imprisoned by it, and understanding that you can choose to be more than the sum of what you were given. Trauma doesn't just hurt us, it fractures us. When the impact is severe enough, the coherent sense of self that we depend on to navigate the world splinters into conflicting pieces. We see this fragmentation literalized in both shows through characters who quite literally become multiple people, who lose track of who they were, who struggle to maintain consistent identity across time. Simon Petrikov's transformation into Ice King and Stephen's corruption into a monster represent two different trajectories of trauma-induced identity dissolution, but both teach us profound truths about how extreme stress breaks down the boundaries of self. Simon Petrikov was an antiquarian who specialized in studying ancient artifacts. He was engaged to Betty Groff, a woman he loved deeply. He had a career, interests, relationships, a future. Then he put on the crown, and all of that began to dissolve. The crown didn't just give Simon ice powers. It rewrote his personality, erased his memories, and eventually replaced him entirely with a different person, Ice King. This transformation wasn't instant. I Remember You and Simon and Marcy show us the horrifying middle period where Simon was losing himself gradually, fighting desperately to maintain his identity even as the crown consumed it. The psychological horror of Simon's situation lies in his awareness of what's happening. He keeps video diaries, leaves notes to himself, tries desperately to warn his future self about the crown's effects. But the crown doesn't just make him forget. It changes what he values, what he wants, what he finds important. The Simon who made those videos cared about not kidnapping princesses. Ice King finds kidnapping princesses delightful. The Simon who loved Betty would never forget her. Ice King has no memory of her until the crown's grip briefly loosens. This isn't just amnesia. It's personality death, a slow-motion execution of the self while the body continues living. In trauma psychology, dissociation represents the mind's emergency response to unbearable experience. When reality becomes too painful or threatening, consciousness can split, creating separate compartments that don't communicate with each other. In extreme cases, as with dissociative identity disorder, this splitting produces genuinely separate identity states with their own memories, preferences, and ways of being in the world. Simon's transformation isn't meant to represent DID literally, but it captures the essential horror of dissociation. The experience of watching yourself become someone you don't recognize, doing things you would never do, while being unable to stop it. What makes Simon's fragmentation particularly tragic is that Ice King isn't just a broken version of Simon. He's a different person with his own experiences, memories, and relationships. Ice King forms genuine friendships, particularly with Finn and Jake. He creates art, writes fan fiction, has hobbies and desires. When the possibility of reversing Ice King back to Simon emerges, it raises a devastating ethical question. Would curing Ice King mean killing him? If we erased Ice King's personality to restore Simon's, wouldn't we be committing a form of murder against the person Ice King has become? This is the deepest horror of identity fragmentation. There's no clean resolution where everyone survives intact. The episode Betty brings this horror to a head when Simon is briefly restored and Betty returns from her time displacement. Betty immediately begins trying to find a way to permanently cure Simon, to bring back the man she loved. But Simon realizes something Betty doesn't. Ice King has lived for hundreds of years, has relationships and a life, and erasing him would be erasing centuries of existence. Simon isn't sure he has the right to destroy Ice King, even to reclaim his own identity. This moral paralysis, the inability to choose between different versions of yourself, represents the ultimate form of identity fragmentation. Stephen's identity fragmentation operates differently, but with equal devastating impact. Stephen doesn't slowly transform into someone else over centuries. Instead, the fragmentation builds internally through accumulated stress until it explodes outward in Steven Universe Future. Throughout the original series, Stephen maintains a remarkably coherent identity. He's the optimistic one, the mediator, the person who believes everyone can be better. But this identity is actually a trauma response, a defensive structure built to handle impossible responsibilities. Stephen isn't genuinely always optimistic. He's performed optimism because he's learned that's what everyone needs from him. The cracks in Stephen's identity appear gradually. His dreams become nightmares, featuring Watermelon Stephen, a version of himself turned violent and primitive. He has increasingly angry outbursts at his family and friends. He describes feeling off, but can't articulate what's wrong. These are symptoms of what psychologists call identity diffusion, when the stable sense of self becomes unstable, when you're not sure who you are or what you actually want because you've spent so long being what others needed. Stephen has been Pink Diamond's legacy, the Crystal Gem's hope, humanity's bridge to gems, Beach City's protector. But who is he when he's just Stephen? The pressure fractures Stephen's identity, most visibly when he accidentally shatters Jasper and brings her back. His horror at discovering he has his mother's capacity for violence triggers a cascade of realizations. He's shattered gems, he's killed corrupted gems before learning they could be healed. He's more like the diamonds than he wants to admit. These realizations don't just make Stephen feel guilty, they undermine his entire self-concept. He thought he was different from the diamonds, better than Rose. But the evidence suggests he's capable of the same violence, the same destructive choices. If he's not the good one, the healing one, the different one, then who is he? Stephen's corruption into a monster is identity fragmentation made physical. He literally stops being human-shaped, stops being able to communicate, stops being recognizable even to himself. The monster Stephen becomes is pure trauma response, all fight or flight reflexes, all defensive rage, no higher reasoning. This is what total identity collapse looks like, when the structures that hold the self together completely fail, when you become nothing but survival mechanisms and pain. The terror on the Crystal Gem's faces when they see Monster Stephen isn't just about his appearance. It's about the recognition that Stephen, as they knew him, is gone, potentially irretrievably. Both Simon's and Stephen's fragmentations reveal a crucial truth about trauma and identity. The self is not a fixed, unchangeable essence. It's a process, a continuous construction that requires certain conditions to maintain. When trauma disrupts those conditions severely enough, the self can shatter. This isn't weakness or failure. It's the inevitable result of impossible pressures applied to human psychology. Simon couldn't maintain Simonness while wearing a crown that literally rewrote his neurology. Stephen couldn't maintain Stephenness while carrying generations of unprocessed trauma, impossible responsibilities, and the weight of everyone else's healing needs. The fragmentation both characters experience also illuminates the relationship between identity and memory. Simon lost his memories and lost himself. Stephen's memories became too heavy, too traumatic, and he lost himself differently. Memory isn't just data storage. It's the narrative thread that connects past self to present self to future self. When that thread breaks, whether through forgetting or through being unable to integrate traumatic memories, identity fragments, you can't maintain a coherent sense of who you are if you can't remember your past, or if your past experiences contradict your self-concept so completely that they can't be integrated. The question both shows pose, but don't fully answer, is whether fragmentation can ever be truly healed or only managed. Simon eventually gets his original personality back, but he's not the same Simon who put on the crown. He's Simon who has lost centuries of time, who missed Betty's entire life, who knows that another person lived in his body for most of his existence. He has to integrate the knowledge of Ice King without having been Ice King consciously. That's not healing. That's a new form of fragmentation, where Simon has to live with a gap in his identity that can never be filled. Stephen's restoration from monster form comes through love and support, through his family and friends, reaching him even in his fragmented state. But he's not restored to his pre-corruption self. He's someone who now knows what it feels like to completely lose control, to become monstrous, to hurt people he loves while being unable to stop. That knowledge changes him permanently. The Stephen who leaves Beach City at the end of Future is neither the optimistic child of the original series nor the corrupted monster. He's someone actively constructing a new identity that integrates both. Someone learning to be himself without the protective structures that previously held him together. Both characters demonstrate that identity fragmentation, once experienced, leaves permanent marks. You can build a new coherent identity, but you can't erase the knowledge that coherence is fragile, that the self can shatter under sufficient pressure. This knowledge itself becomes part of identity. You become someone who knows they broke, someone who has to consciously maintain wholeness rather than assuming it naturally. This isn't hopeless, but it does mean that healing from identity fragmentation isn't returning to who you were before. It's becoming someone new who carries the knowledge of fragmentation as a permanent part of their story. The show's willingness to engage seriously with identity fragmentation distinguishes them from most children's media, which typically treats identity as stable and consistent. Characters might learn and grow, but they remain recognizably themselves. Simon and Stephen show us that extreme trauma can actually destroy who you are, can fragment you so completely that the pieces might not fit back together the same way. This is terrifying to contemplate, especially for young viewers still forming their own identities. But it's also validating for anyone who has experienced their sense of self shatter under trauma's weight. Both shows acknowledge that this happens, that it's real, and that there might be a way forward even after complete fragmentation. Not a way back to who you were, but a way toward becoming someone new who can hold all the pieces, even the ones that don't fit together neatly. Hero mythology is one of culture's oldest trauma responses, a way of making sense of violence and chaos by imagining individuals strong enough to stand against them. But both Adventure Time and Steven Universe interrogate what happens when real, vulnerable people try to live inside hero mythology. Finn begins the series as someone actively constructing himself as a hero, adopting a heroic identity before he's old enough to understand what that means. Steven inherits hero status, whether he wants it or not, expected to live up to Rose Quartz's legacy while still figuring out who he is. Both characters demonstrate that the role of hero isn't just demanding, it's actively traumatic when imposed on children who lack the developmental capacity to handle it. Finn's heroism begins as play. In early episodes, he's a kid having adventures, rescuing princesses, because that's what heroes do in the stories. His adoptive parents apparently raised him on hero mythology, filled his imagination with grand quests and noble deeds. But Finn takes this play identity seriously, too seriously for a child. By the age of 12, he's already defined himself primarily through heroic action. When he's not actively heroing, he experiences restlessness and anxiety, as if his worth depends entirely on whether he's currently saving someone. This isn't healthy childhood play. It's the beginning of a compulsive pattern that will damage him throughout adolescence. The psychological concept of the hero complex, or savior complex, describes people who define their worth through rescuing others. It often develops in childhood as a response to family dysfunction. If you couldn't save your actual family from their problems, you might unconsciously try to save everyone else as a form of displaced rescue. Finn's obsessive heroism makes sense in this context. He's the last human, abandoned by his biological parents, adopted into a family of magical dogs. He has no cultural inheritance, no human elders to guide him, no community of humans to belong to. Heroism gives him identity, purpose, and a way to earn belonging. If he's valuable as a hero, no one will abandon him. If he's always saving people, he'll always be needed. But the hero role requires suppressing vulnerability. Heroes don't cry, don't admit fear, don't acknowledge pain. When Finn loses his arm to the grass sword in Escape from the Citadel, he treats it as a minor setback rather than a traumatic amputation. When his father callously abandons him again, Finn processes the rejection through anger rather than grief. When Princess Bubblegum rejects his romantic feelings, Finn doubles down on heroism rather than processing the loss. The hero mask doesn't allow for healthy emotional processing. It demands constant strength, constant capability, constant willingness to sacrifice. This is sustainable for a while, especially for a child whose emotional regulatory systems aren't fully developed, but it creates a debt that eventually comes due. Finn's heroism becomes increasingly compulsive and destructive through the series. His relationship with Flame Princess is contaminated by his hero complex. He needs her to need saving, needs to be the one who helps her control her powers. When she becomes capable and self-sufficient, Finn unconsciously creates situations where she needs him again. The revelation that he's been manipulating her into fights that he's recorded and watches repeatedly represents the hero complex metastasizing into something toxic. He's not helping her. He's creating her problems so he can solve them, ensuring he remains necessary. This is the dark side of heroism. When your identity depends on others needing you, you have an unconscious investment in their continued dependency. The series gradually deconstructs Finn's hero identity by showing its costs. His relationships suffer because he can't be vulnerable enough to truly connect. His body suffers. By series end, Finn has lost his arm, been transformed into a massive glob, died and been reincarnated. His mental health suffers as he accumulates trauma without processing it, storing up emotional wounds that he tries to heroism his way past. The later seasons show Finn becoming quieter, more contemplative, less certain that heroism is the answer to everything. He's learning that being a hero isn't actually a personality, isn't actually a sufficient identity, isn't actually sustainable without support and emotional honesty. Stephen's hero burden operates differently because it's explicitly inherited rather than self-constructed. Rose Quartz was legendary, the rebel leader who stood up to Homeworld, the healer who could bring corrupted gems back from the brink, the founder of the crystal gems who embodied hope and protection. Stephen doesn't have to choose to be a hero. Everyone assumes he will be one because his mother was. The crystal gems train him in gem powers. The people of Beach City expect him to handle gem threats. Even Stephen's own gem glows with Rose's abilities, a constant physical reminder that he's supposed to live up to her legacy. The toxic positivity Stephen develops represents his attempt to be the hero everyone needs. Rose was apparently always optimistic, always saw the best in everyone, always believed problems could be solved through understanding and compassion. Stephen internalizes this as a requirement rather than a personality trait. When things are bad, he forces himself to smile. When he's scared, he performs confidence. When he's angry or hurt, he suppresses it to maintain the role of the understanding one, the patient one, the one who brings everyone together. This isn't genuine emotional processing. It's emotional performance designed to fulfill the hero role. Steven Universe Future explicitly examines the cost of childhood heroism through Stephen's increasing mental health crisis. The series begins with Stephen post-victory. He's defeated the Diamonds, healed corruption, brought peace between Earth and Homeworld. He's succeeded at everything heroes are supposed to succeed at, but instead of feeling accomplished, he feels empty. His entire identity was built around being needed, being the one who solves problems, being the hero. Now that the major problems are solved, what is he? Who is Stephen when he's not actively saving the world? This existential crisis reveals how hollow the hero identity actually was. It was a role, a performance, a way of avoiding the harder work of developing a genuine, autonomous identity. The psychological term role fusion describes when someone becomes so identified with a particular role that they lose the ability to distinguish between the role and their authentic self. Stephen has experienced role fusion. He doesn't know where Stephen the hero ends and Stephen the person begins, because he's never had the space to develop an identity separate from heroism. This is particularly damaging when imposed on children whose identity formation requires exploration, experimentation, and the freedom to fail without catastrophic consequences. Stephen wasn't allowed to fail. Failure meant people died, gems got corrupted, Earth got conquered, The stakes were always too high for normal childhood development. Both Finn and Stephen demonstrate how the hero role functions as a trauma response that creates additional trauma. The original trauma, abandonment, inherited responsibility, impossible expectations, generates the hero complex as a coping mechanism. But the coping mechanism itself traumatizes through its demands, constant vigilance, emotional suppression, physical danger, and the weight of others' survival depending on your success. You develop the hero identity to manage trauma, but then the hero identity generates new trauma, creating a cycle that's difficult to escape without external intervention. The shows also explore how hero culture itself is traumatic for those cast in hero roles. Beach City treats Stephen as their protector, but they also treat him as less than fully human. His needs matter less than their protection. His childhood is less important than his duties. Oo treats Finn as a legend, but legends aren't people. They're symbols, stories, inspirations. The adulation that surrounds heroes is dehumanizing. It places them on pedestals where they can't be vulnerable, can't admit doubt, can't rest. Every citizen of Beach City who sleeps peacefully because Stephen is protecting them is unconsciously contributing to the pressure that eventually breaks him. The deconstruction of heroism in both shows reaches similar conclusions. Heroism is necessary but insufficient. Someone does need to stand up to the diamonds, to fight the lich, to protect the vulnerable. But framing this as an individual hero's responsibility rather than a collective obligation traumatizes the person designated as hero. Finn's healthiest moments come when he stops trying to be the hero and instead works as part of a team, alongside Jake, Princess Bubblegum, Marceline, and others. Stephen's healing begins when he acknowledges that he can't and shouldn't have to save everyone, that it's okay to let others take responsibility, that his worth isn't determined by constant heroic action. The weight of being the hero ultimately crushes both characters in different ways before they learn to put it down. Not completely, not to abandon responsibility, but enough to reclaim their humanity. Finn becomes someone who helps because he chooses to, not because it's his defining identity. Stephen learns that he can be good without being everyone's savior. Both journeys involve the painful recognition that the hero identity they built or inherited was never sustainable, never healthy, never a sufficient foundation for a genuine self. The real heroism both characters eventually demonstrate is the courage to stop being the hero as they understood it, and to discover who they might be beyond that crushing weight. One of the most insidious forms of trauma occurs when children must care for the adults who should be caring for them. This role reversal, called parentification in psychology, scrambles the developmental structure that children need to grow into healthy adults. Both shows feature this dynamic prominently through Marceline's relationship with Simon and Stephen's relationship with the crystal gems. In both cases, children find themselves managing adults' emotional needs, providing caretaking they're too young to provide, sacrificing their own development to keep damaged adults functional. The cost of this reversal echoes throughout their lives. Marceline meets Simon in the immediate aftermath of the Mushroom War. She's a child, likely no more than 7 or 8 years old, wandering in a devastated landscape. Her mother has apparently recently died. We see Simon find Marceline alone, singing the song her mother taught her about drinking red as a way to process loss. Simon becomes her protector, her guardian, the adult who keeps her alive in an apocalyptic wasteland. But Simon is wearing the crown. Even as he protects Marceline, he's losing himself. The tragedy of their relationship is that Marceline has to watch her protector disappear while depending on him for survival. The episode Simon and Marcy shows this dynamic explicitly. Young Marceline is sick, needs medicine, needs food. Simon is trying to care for her, but is increasingly erratic, talking to himself, having memory lapses, exhibiting behavior that terrifies Marceline. When Simon puts on the crown to save them from danger, he becomes Ice King temporarily, powerful enough to defeat threats, but completely unrecognizable to the child depending on him. Marceline has to bring Simon back from these episodes, has to remind him who he is, has to function as his anchor to reality, even though she's just a child who needs anchoring herself. This is role reversal at its most stark. The child managing the adult's mental illness, providing emotional regulation the adult can no longer self-generate, sacrificing her own needs to keep her caretaker functional. The song, I Remember You, encapsulates the permanent damage this role reversal causes. Present-day Marceline is nearly 1,000 years old, but she still carries the wound of watching Simon forget her, still experiences grief and anger at having lost her protector. Ice King doesn't remember her, doesn't remember being Simon, doesn't understand why this strange vampire woman seems so angry and sad around him. Marceline has spent centuries living with the memory of being a child who had to be strong enough to watch her guardian lose his mind without being able to stop it. That's not a wound that heals. It's a wound that restructures your entire relationship to care, trust, and vulnerability. Parentification creates what psychologists call compulsive caregiving, an inability to not caretake, an anxiety that emerges when you're not helping someone, a sense that your value derives entirely from being useful to others. Marceline exhibits this pattern throughout her millennia of life. She takes care of Simon even after he's become Ice King, visiting him, managing his chaotic behavior, protecting him from threats he doesn't recognize. She caretakes Princess Bubblegum during their relationship, providing emotional support that Bubblegum struggles to reciprocate. She even caretakes Finn and Jake in subtle ways, offering guidance and protection despite her own ongoing trauma. Marceline never learned that it's okay to need care yourself because she spent her childhood providing it. Stephen's parentification is more complex because the crystal gems genuinely try to care for him, but they're so damaged by their own trauma that Stephen ends up managing theirs. Pearl's grief for Rose is so consuming that Stephen often comforts her about his mother's death, the child consoling the adult for losing the person who gave birth to him. Amethyst's insecurity about being made wrong means Stephen frequently has to bolster her self-esteem, providing emotional support she should be receiving from her fellow adult gems. Even Garnet, the most emotionally stable, sometimes relies on Stephen's optimism to maintain her own equilibrium during crises. The episode Mindful Education reveals how heavy this burden has become. When Connie struggles with her actions in a fight, Garnet teaches both children meditation techniques for managing difficult emotions. But the memories Stephen confronts during meditation aren't just his own traumas. They're the gems he shattered, the corrupted gems he couldn't save, the shattering of Jasper that he caused. These are adult-level traumas, violent deaths he's responsible for, existential questions about the nature of helping versus harming. Stephen is 12 years old and processing PTSD-level memories, while also being expected to provide emotional stability for the adults around him. This is untenable. Stephen's compulsive caretaking manifests as his healing powers. He literally has the ability to heal others' trauma, corruption, and physical damage. This power is a gift, but it's also a curse, because it creates the expectation that Stephen should heal everyone, that his own pain matters less than his ability to fix others' pain. When Stephen himself breaks down in Steven Universe Future, he's confused and frustrated that his healing powers don't work on himself. He's spent his entire life being the healer, the one who fixes things, the one who makes others whole. The revelation that he can't heal his own trauma, that he needs others to care for him, contradicts everything his role reversal taught him about his purpose. The psychological impact of parentification includes role confusion, difficulty establishing boundaries, and chronic anxiety about others' well-being. Both Marceline and Stephen exhibit these patterns. Marceline has difficulty letting people care for her. When Princess Bubblegum tries to help her, Marceline often becomes defensive or dismissive. She's so accustomed to being the caretaker that receiving care feels wrong, uncomfortable, threatening. Stephen similarly struggles to accept help, to admit when he's struggling, to believe that his needs matter as much as everyone else's needs. When he finally breaks down and reveals his mental health crisis to the crystal gems, it's only after reaching a point of complete dysfunction. He couldn't ask for help while he was still capable of providing care to others. The role reversal both characters experience also creates complex guilt. When Marceline couldn't save Simon from the crown, she felt responsible for his transformation into Ice King, even though she was a child with no power to stop magical artifacts. This is the child's logic of parentification. If my job was to take care of this adult and they fell apart, I must have failed. Adult logic recognizes that children shouldn't bear responsibility for adults' well-being, but child logic doesn't have that perspective. The child who was parentified carries forward the belief that they should have done more, been stronger, sacrificed better. This guilt is irrational but powerful, shaping decades or even centuries of self-perception. Stephen's guilt operates similarly. He feels responsible for Rose's choices, for the crystal gems' happiness, for the entire history of gem-human relations. When things go wrong, he assumes he failed to care adequately for everyone affected. This is parentification logic, the child believing that adult problems are their responsibility to solve. The healthier response would be recognizing that Stephen was a child, thrust into adult conflicts, that the crystal gems should have protected him better, that his developmental needs should have taken priority over using him to resolve millennia-old gem politics. But Stephen can't access this healthier perspective easily because the role reversal was so complete, so early, so all-encompassing. Both shows demonstrate that healing from parentification requires learning to receive care without guilt or discomfort. Marceline's relationship with Princess Bubblegum becomes healthier when she allows herself to be vulnerable, to need comfort, to let Bubblegum support her. Stephen's healing in Steven Universe Future involves the crystal gems finally recognizing that they failed to protect him from role reversal, explicitly apologizing for making him their emotional caretaker, and actively working to reverse the pattern by prioritizing his needs. This reversal can't undo the damage. Marceline will always carry the memory of losing Simon. Stephen will always remember being 12 and managing adult crises, but it can interrupt the pattern going forward. The final truth both shows offer about role reversal trauma is that it's preventable, but rarely prevented. Adults experiencing their own trauma often can't help but lean on the nearest support, even if that support is a child. Simon didn't want to burden Marceline with managing his deterioration, but he was deteriorating, and she was there. The crystal gems didn't want to make Stephen their emotional anchor, but they were drowning in grief, and he was Rose's living legacy, Rose's final gift, Rose's hope for the future. Understanding why role reversal happens doesn't eliminate its traumatic impact, but it does help the parentified child, later an adult themselves, recognize that the reversal wasn't their fault, wasn't their failure, wasn't something they should have somehow handled better. They were children asked to do adults' emotional work. They survived it. And that survival, however costly, deserves recognition rather than continued guilt. Both Adventure Time and Steven Universe refuse the comforting narrative that grief has a timeline, that mourning follows predictable stages ending in acceptance and peace. Instead, they show us characters living with losses that never stop hurting, absences that never fill in, grief that becomes a permanent part of the landscape of self. This is a more honest and more difficult vision of loss than most media offers. The shows acknowledge that some grief doesn't resolve. It transforms, shifts, becomes something you carry rather than something you overcome. But it doesn't end. Understanding how characters navigate permanent loss reveals truths about trauma that momentary sadness can never teach. The Ice King's grief for Betty is the grief of someone who doesn't consciously remember what he's lost. For most of the series, Ice King has no idea Betty existed. He kidnaps princesses compulsively, searching for a bride, for someone to fill the emptiness he feels but cannot name. This is grief without memory, loss without context, perhaps the cruelest form. Ice King experiences the emotional reality of abandonment without understanding what he's been abandoned from. He's lonely in a way that can't be satisfied because what he actually needs, Betty, his old life, his sanity, is unavailable, and he doesn't even know to mourn it specifically. When Simon briefly returns to himself in Betty and sees her again after she's travelled through time to find him, the grief becomes conscious and devastating. He remembers everything he lost, not just Betty but himself, his career, his human life, 900 years of existence. He experiences compressed grief, centuries of loss hitting him in moments, Betty's desperate attempt to cure him, her willingness to sacrifice anything to bring Simon back, reflects the magical thinking that often accompanies grief. The belief that if we just try hard enough, make the right sacrifice, find the right solution, we can undo the loss. But Simon recognizes what Betty doesn't, that Ice King has lived for centuries, that erasing him would be its own form of loss, that there might not be a solution that restores everything. Betty's eventual transformation into GOLB's embodiment represents grief's ultimate corruption. She sacrifices her own existence trying to save Simon, but the method, merging with a chaos god, means she's lost to him in a different way. Simon gets his sanity back, but loses Betty forever, not to death or time, but to transformation into something incomprehensible. This is loss without closure, grief without even a body to mourn. Betty exists, but not as Betty, is alive, but not as anything Simon can reach or communicate with. Some losses, the show suggests, don't come with the mercy of finality. They leave you with absence that has presence, with someone gone but not gone enough to properly mourn. Marceline's grief for her mother layers across centuries. In Everything Stays, we learn that Marceline's mother gave her Hambo, a stuffed toy, shortly before dying. The song Everything Stays is about how things change, but something about them remains. A child's attempt to process the permanence of loss while maintaining connection to what was lost. Marceline keeps Hambo for 1,000 years, a physical anchor to her mother and her pre-apocalyptic childhood. When she loses Hambo to Madja the Sky Witch, the grief resurfaces with full force, as if her mother died yesterday rather than a millennium ago. This is how long-term grief works, mostly integrated into daily life, until something triggers the original wound, and it's fresh again. The revelation that Marceline's mother was human and died when Marceline was very young adds layers to her grief. Marceline is half demon and ages much slower than humans. She had to watch her mother grow old and die while she remained a child. This is anticipatory grief, knowing from early on that she would lose her mother, that their time was limited in ways most parent-child relationships aren't. Then the Mushroom War happened, and Marceline lost not just her mother, but the entire world her mother existed in. She carries compound loss, personal grief for her mother, contextual grief for pre-war humanity, existential grief for childhood and safety, relational grief for Simon's sanity. Her 1,000 years of life haven't healed these losses. They've just given her a very long time to carry them. Princess Bubblegum's relationship with grief is complicated by her near immortality and her role as sovereign. She's lost subjects, friends, experiments, entire iterations of Candy Kingdom. In the cooler, we see her working herself to exhaustion, unable to rest, because rest means confronting feelings she's been avoiding. Bubblegum handles grief through control and productivity. If she's busy enough, if she's solving enough problems, she doesn't have to feel the losses. This is a common trauma response: achievement as anesthesia, busyness as avoidance. But the grief doesn't go away. It accumulates, waiting for any moment of vulnerability to surface. Her relationship with Marceline carries historical grief that nearly destroyed their bond. We learn in the Stakes miniseries that they were close during the early post-war period, but something caused a rift that lasted centuries. The details remain ambiguous, but the emotional reality is clear. They hurt each other badly enough that both carried the wound for hundreds of years. Their reconciliation doesn't erase those centuries of loss. It exists alongside them. They get each other back, but they can't get back the centuries they spent apart. That time is gone, and the version of their relationship that might have existed if they'd never separated is gone too. They build something new, but it's built on top of permanent loss. Stephen's grief operates primarily around Rose, a mother he never met, but whose absence structures his entire life. This is anticipatory grief in reverse, grieving someone before you even have conscious memory of them. Stephen knows from early childhood that his mother gave up her form to create him, that her continued existence and his are mutually exclusive. This creates impossible emotional math. Should he be grateful for existing, guilty that his existence required her death, angry that she abandoned him before he was born? All of these simultaneously? There's no healthy way to process grief for someone whose death was required for your life. The reveal that Rose was Pink Diamond transforms Stephen's grief into something more complex and more bitter. He wasn't just mourning a heroic rebel who sacrificed herself for him. He was mourning a deeply flawed person who created catastrophic problems and then escaped accountability by becoming him. Stephen's grief turns to anger in Steven Universe Future. Anger that Rose left him to clean up her messes, that she never explained herself, that she made him responsible for millennia of consequences from choices he didn't make. This is grief mixed with betrayal, loss mixed with abandonment. Stephen has to mourn his mother while also resenting her, has to hold both grief and anger without clear resolution. The death of Rose is further complicated because she's not entirely gone. Her gem is in Stephen's body. Her room still exists and responds to his desires. Her powers manifest through him. This is ambiguous loss, a psychological term for loss without clear boundaries. Stephen experiences Rose's absence, but also her strange persistence. He can't fully mourn her as dead because she's not fully dead. He can't have a relationship with her because she's not fully alive. This ambiguity prevents the kind of grief resolution that comes from clear endings. Stephen is permanently suspended between having a mother and not having one. The crystal gems carry layered grief that predates Stephen's existence. They lost their entire world when they rebelled. Homeworld, gem culture, the possibility of return. They lost countless friends and comrades in the war, gems who were shattered or corrupted. They lost Rose twice, once when they thought Pink Diamond was shattered, again when Rose gave up her form for Stephen. Pearl's grief for Rose is particularly consuming. She dedicated her entire existence to Rose, built her identity around serving and loving her, and then lost her to a choice Pearl couldn't prevent or participate in. Pearl's relationship with grief borders on pathological. She can't let go, can't move forward, can't imagine herself as separate from her loss. Garnet's grief is more contained, but no less real. She lost the possibility of rebellion's success as she'd imagined it. Rose's reveal as Pink Diamond meant the entire war was based on deception. She lost the future she'd envisioned, where Rose would lead them forward. She lost, repeatedly, the stability she tries to provide others when she unfuses under stress. Garnet's future vision means she experiences anticipatory grief constantly, seeing potential losses before they occur, mourning futures that might not happen, carrying the weight of knowledge about how bad things could get. Amethyst's grief centers on identity rather than specific losses. She never knew Homeworld or the war directly. She emerged after the fighting ended, already an orphan of circumstances she didn't create. Her grief is for belonging she never had, for a purpose she arrived too late to fulfill, for gem siblings who were destroyed before she existed. She grieves what she never got to have, which is a particular form of loss, mourning the absence rather than the presence, grieving potentiality rather than actuality. Both shows demonstrate that unresolved grief gets displaced into other areas of life. Ice King's princess kidnapping is displaced grief for Betty. Pearl's need for control is displaced grief for Rose. Marceline's difficulty with vulnerability is displaced grief for her mother and Simon. Stephen's compulsive heroism is displaced grief for the mother he never knew but is constantly compared to. When grief can't be processed directly because the loss is too overwhelming, too permanent, too ambiguous, it leaks out sideways, shaping behavior in ways that seem irrational until you understand the underlying loss. The shows also explore how grief can be both individual and collective. The Mushroom War created collective grief for all of Wu. Every character lives in the aftermath of humanity's self-destruction. The Gem War created collective grief for gems on all sides. Homeworld grieves Pink Diamond. The crystal gems grieve their shattered comrades. Corrupted gems embody traumatic grief made physical. When grief is collective, it becomes environmental. You're not just carrying your own loss. You're breathing the air of everyone else's loss, living in landscapes shaped by shared trauma. The most honest truth both shows offer about grief is that it doesn't follow the neat stages psychology once proposed. There's no linear progression from denial through anger to acceptance. Instead, grief spirals. You think you've processed it, then something triggers it, and you're back in the acute phase. You accept the loss, then rage against it. You move forward, then collapse backward. Marceline has had 1,000 years to process her losses, but I Remember You shows her breaking down, as if Simon just forgot her yesterday. Stephen spends the entire original series seemingly accepting that he'll never meet Rose. Then Steven Universe Future reveals he's been carrying unprocessed grief and anger the whole time. Both shows suggest that living with permanent loss means accepting that grief becomes part of your identity, rather than something separate from it. You don't overcome the loss of your mother, your sanity, your entire world. You become someone who has lost those things, and that someone is who you are now. Healing isn't removing the grief. It's expanding yourself enough to hold the grief alongside joy, connection, purpose, and meaning. It's learning to carry the permanent absence without letting it consume everything else. It's acknowledging that some losses will hurt forever, and that's not a failure of healing. It's a testament to how much what was lost actually mattered. Love is supposed to heal, but trauma can corrupt love into something that wounds. Both shows explore relationships where genuine affection exists alongside destructive patterns, where people hurt each other not despite love, but through it. These aren't simple abusive relationships where one person is clearly villainous. They're complex entanglements where trauma responses clash, where past wounds generate present harm, where people damage what they most want to protect. Understanding these toxic dynamics reveals how trauma doesn't just affect individuals, but distorts the connections between them. Pearl's relationship with rose quartz represents obsessive attachment taken to its extreme. Pearl wasn't just devoted to Rose, she constructed her entire identity around that devotion. In Story for Stephen and We Need to Talk, we see Pearl's possessiveness of Rose, her resentment toward Greg, her inability to accept that Rose could have other meaningful relationships. Pearl experiences Rose's love for others as betrayal, as if Rose's heart should have been exclusively hers. This isn't healthy love. It's what psychologists call enmeshed attachment, when boundaries between self and other dissolve so completely that the other person's autonomy feels like abandonment. The episode Rose's Scabbard reveals the depth of Pearl's toxic attachment. When she discovers Rose kept the armory secret from her, Pearl experiences it as ultimate betrayal. She nearly lets herself fall to her death, because if Rose didn't share everything with her, then their bond meant nothing. This is binary thinking common to trauma-damaged attachment. Either we're completely fused, or we're nothing. Pearl can't conceive of a healthy middle ground where Rose loved her deeply, but still maintained appropriate boundaries, still had private spaces, still made choices Pearl didn't agree with. For Pearl, partial access feels like total rejection. Pearl's toxicity extends to her relationship with Stephen. She loves him genuinely, but she also can't stop seeing him as Rose's continuation. In Sworn to the Sword, Pearl trains Connie using the same toxic philosophy she applied to herself, that your life means nothing except as sacrifice for the person you serve. She's literally teaching a child that self-destruction is the highest form of love, that your worth derives entirely from your willingness to die for someone else. This is generational trauma in action. Pearl is passing down her own damaged attachment patterns to the next generation, normalizing toxicity as devotion. The revelation that Rose was Pink Diamond adds another layer to Pearl's toxic attachment. Rose ordered Pearl to never speak the truth, and Pearl obeyed for thousands of years, even when keeping the secret hurt her friends and damaged Stephen. Pearl's love was so consuming that she prioritized Rose's command over everyone else's well-being, including her own. She carried the secret through Rose's transformation into Stephen, through every moment when revealing the truth could have prevented harm, because her attachment to Rose superseded her ethical obligations to everyone else. This is toxic loyalty, when devotion to one person justifies harming others. Flame Princess and Finn's relationship demonstrates how trauma can poison romance before it even fully begins. Flame Princess was imprisoned by her father for being too dangerous, raised to believe her emotions were weapons that hurt people. Finn enters her life as potential salvation, someone who sees her as a person rather than a threat. But Finn's own trauma warps the relationship. His need to be the hero, to be needed, means he unconsciously wants Flame Princess to remain someone who needs saving. When she grows more capable and autonomous, Finn feels threatened. The reveal that Finn has been secretly recording Flame Princess's fights and watching them repeatedly is deeply disturbing. He's been manipulating her into battles so he can watch her lose control, so he can see her vulnerable and needing him. This is voyeuristic and exploitative, treating her struggles as entertainment, her pain as something he can produce and consume. When Flame Princess discovers this, she breaks up with him, recognizing correctly that Finn's love had become toxic, that he was more invested in his hero fantasy than in her actual well-being. Finn thought he loved her, and in some sense he did, but his love was contaminated by his need to be essential to her. Princess Bubblegum's governance of the Candy Kingdom reveals how control masquerading as care becomes authoritarian and harmful. Bubblegum surveils her citizens, makes decisions about their lives without consent, and justifies it all through protection. She created the Candy People, but treats them as subjects to be managed, rather than autonomous beings. Her relationship with the Earl of Lemongrab exemplifies this toxic dynamic. She created him imperfectly, found him disturbing, and essentially exiled him, rather than taking responsibility for his well-being. When Lemongrab becomes tyrannical, Bubblegum's response is to modify him rather than address the systemic harm she caused by creating and abandoning him. Her relationship with Marceline carries traces of this same controlling toxicity. In their past relationship, Bubblegum's need for control apparently conflicted with Marceline's need for emotional authenticity. Bubblegum processes everything intellectually, keeps tight emotional regulation, plans and strategizes rather than feeling. Marceline needs emotional honesty, vulnerability, spontaneity. Neither is wrong, but their incompatible trauma responses created a toxic dynamic where both felt misunderstood and hurt. They separated for centuries rather than working through it, which is its own form of toxicity, the complete avoidance of conflict rather than healthy resolution. The show also explores toxic family dynamics through Martin and Finn. Martin is Finn's biological father, but has no capacity for healthy attachment. He's entirely self-interested, sees relationships as transactional, feels no genuine bond with his son. When Finn finally meets Martin, desperate for father-son connection, Martin is casually cruel in his indifference. This isn't explosive abuse, it's neglect weaponized through emotional unavailability. Martin's toxicity lies in his complete inability to love, his fundamental lack of connection to anything beyond his own immediate survival and comfort. Finn's response to Martin's rejection reveals how toxic relationships can make us toxic toward others. After Martin abandons him again, Finn becomes cynical, withdrawn, prone to anger. He pushes Jake away, hurts Princess Bubblegum with cruel comments, engages in risky behavior. Martin's toxicity infected Finn, made him unable to trust love from anyone else, turned his pain outward into behavior that damaged his other relationships. This is how relational trauma spreads. One toxic relationship poisons the capacity for healthy connection elsewhere. Steven Universe explores toxic dynamics through the Diamond's relationships with each other, and Pink Diamond specifically. Yellow and Blue Diamond's grief for Pink is so consuming that it makes them tyrannical. They channel their pain into stricter control, harsher punishment of deviation, total intolerance for anything that reminds them of Pink. Their love for Pink was genuine, but their expression of that love, controlling her, dismissing her concerns, treating her like a child who needed to be managed, was toxic. Pink's rebellion was partly a response to being loved in a way that felt like suffocation. Pink Diamond's own capacity for toxic behavior becomes clear as we learn more about her. She abandoned Spinel in the garden for 6,000 years because Spinel annoyed her, because Pink wanted to appear more mature and Spinel represented childishness. This is callous abandonment, dressed up as outgrowing someone. Toxic, because Pink never communicated her intentions, never gave Spinel closure, just left her waiting, literally, forever. Pink's relationship with Pearl involved ordering Pearl to keep secrets that damaged everyone. Her relationship with Greg seems healthier, but even there, she was escaping from responsibilities rather than addressing them. The episodes exploring Lapis Lazuli and Jasper's fusion as malachite present toxic codependency explicitly. Their fusion is held together by mutual hatred and pain. Lapis keeps them fused to imprison Jasper. Jasper keeps them fused because she's addicted to the power. Both are being harmed by the fusion. Both recognize it's destroying them, but neither can let go. This is trauma bonding, when shared pain creates attachment that feels unbreakable even when it's obviously harmful. When they finally separate, both have been damaged by the toxic fusion in ways that affect their future relationships. Lapis's subsequent relationship with Peridot shows how trauma from toxic relationships affects new ones. Lapis is hypervigilant about being trapped, hypersensitive to any conflict, prone to leaving preemptively rather than working through problems. When the diamonds threaten Earth, Lapis abandons Peridot and flees, unable to trust that staying and fighting alongside others could work. Her time as Malachite taught her that relationships trap you, that the only safety is in isolation. She has to unlearn this toxic lesson gradually, painfully, making mistakes as she tries to relearn healthy attachment. Both shows demonstrate that toxic relationships often involve people who genuinely love each other, but whose trauma responses are incompatible or mutually triggering. Pearl loved Rose genuinely, but her trauma-based possessiveness damaged the relationship. Finn loved Flame Princess genuinely, but his hero complex corrupted that love into manipulation. The Diamonds loved Pink genuinely, but their controlling behavior drove her away. These aren't simple villain-victim dynamics. They're complex entanglements where everyone is both hurt and hurting, both victim and perpetrator, both sincere and destructive. The psychology of trauma explains these dynamics through the concept of repetition, of compulsion, the tendency to recreate traumatic relationship patterns unconsciously. Pearl repeats her pattern of self-abnegating devotion across relationships because it's what she knows, what feels like love to her. Finn repeats his pattern of trying to be the hero who saves people because his identity depends on it. Lapis repeats her pattern of isolation because vulnerability has been too dangerous. These patterns feel safe even when they're destructive because they're familiar, because changing them requires confronting the trauma that created them. Breaking toxic relationship patterns requires recognizing them first, which is extraordinarily difficult when you're inside them. Pearl doesn't recognize her devotion to Rose as toxic. To her, it's the highest love. Finn doesn't recognize his heroism as manipulative. To him, it's genuine care. The shows suggest that outside perspective helps. Stephen pointing out Pearl's harmful behavior, Flame Princess rejecting Finn's manipulation, other gems confronting the Diamond's authoritarianism. But even with outside perspective, changing requires enormous effort and willingness to feel the trauma that's driving the toxic behavior. Both shows offer hope that toxic patterns can be interrupted and healthier relationships built. Pearl's later relationship with Mystery Girl and her healing journey show her learning to have identity separate from devotion. Finn's growth in later seasons shows him learning vulnerability and genuine partnership. The Diamonds begin changing their controlling behavior after Stephen forces them to confront the harm they've caused. These changes are neither quick nor complete, but they demonstrate that toxic attachment patterns aren't permanent. They can be recognized, worked through, and transformed into healthier ways of connecting. The key is recognizing that love alone isn't enough. Love combined with unprocessed trauma creates toxicity. Love combined with conscious healing creates the possibility for genuine, non-damaging connection. Trauma isn't only an individual experience. It can affect entire communities, societies, even worlds. Both shows explore how collective trauma operates differently from personal trauma, how it becomes embedded in culture, in systems, in the very structure of how groups organize themselves. Beach City and the Land of Oo are both communities shaped fundamentally by traumatic history, and their collective responses to that history reveal truths about how groups process, avoid, or perpetuate shared wounds. Beach City's relationship to the crystal gems exemplifies one form of collective trauma response: protective denial. Most Beach City residents know the crystal gems exist and vaguely understand they fight monsters, but they've developed a kind of comfortable ignorance about the existential stakes. They don't ask too many questions about where the monsters come from, why there are ancient gem structures around, or what would happen if the crystal gems failed. This willful ignorance is a collective coping mechanism. If they don't think too hard about the danger, they can maintain normal lives, have normal concerns, raise families, and run businesses without constant terror. This denial has costs. When actual gem threats emerge, Beach City residents are unprepared, vulnerable, sometimes resentful that their protected bubble has been popped. During the homeworld invasion, we see panic, confusion, anger, directed at the crystal gems for allowing this to happen, as if being protected from knowledge of danger meant being protected from danger itself. The collective denial that made normal life possible also made the community fragile, unable to cope when threats became undeniable. The episode Ronaldo satirizes this dynamic through Ronaldo's conspiracy theories and desire to be part of the crystal gems. He represents the community member who can't maintain comfortable denial, who obsessively seeks truth about the dangers they face, but who has no healthy framework for processing that truth. His conspiracy theories are both more accurate and more distorted than most Beach City residents' understanding. He's right that there are massive cosmic threats, but wrong about almost every specific detail. This is what happens when collective denial prevents healthy communal processing of shared threat. Individuals who break through the denial often end up with distorted rather than clear understanding. Beach City's collective trauma also manifests in how they relate to Stephen. They love him as a person, but also unconsciously depend on him as their protector, their buffer between normal life and cosmic horror. This creates collective parentification, the entire community treating a child as responsible for their safety. They don't intend this harm, don't consciously decide to burden Stephen this way, but the collective effect of their reliance shapes his development as surely as any individual relationship. When Stephen has his breakdown in Steven Universe Future, part of what he's responding to is years of being the community's designated protector without the community acknowledging what that role cost him. The Land of Oo demonstrates a different collective trauma response: radical acceptance of weirdness, as the new normal. After the Mushroom War, the survivors and their descendants built a civilization that treats constant strangeness, danger, and magical chaos as unremarkable. Candy people exist alongside fire people, alongside cloud people, alongside sentient breakfast foods, and nobody finds this particularly notable. This normalization of the bizarre is a collective defense mechanism. If everything is weird, nothing is traumatic. If danger is constant and random, there's no point in being hypervigilant about specific threats. This creates a society with very little collective memory or historical consciousness. Most Ooh inhabitants don't know about the Mushroom War, don't understand they're living in post-apocalyptic ruins, don't connect their current reality to a specific historical trauma. This collective amnesia is functional in some ways. It allows for joy, creativity, and community without being crushed by awareness of what was lost. But it's also dangerous because it prevents learning from the past, prevents collective processing of the trauma that shaped their world, prevents taking precautions against similar catastrophes. The human islands in the Islands miniseries show another collective trauma response: total withdrawal. The human population that survived the Mushroom War eventually found islands and decided to hide, to never interact with the wider world again, to erase their own memories of the war and raise their children in deliberate ignorance. This is collective trauma, creating collective isolation, an entire society organizing around the principle that safety requires complete disengagement from everything outside their control. The founders literally used technology to erase traumatic memories, believing that removing the memory of trauma would remove trauma itself. But the trauma remained, encoded in their social structures, if not their conscious memories. The island's society is rigid, fearful of change, intolerant of deviation, suspicious of anything unknown. They don't remember why they're afraid, but they've built their entire civilization around that nameless fear. This is intergenerational trauma at a societal level, emotional patterns transmitted across generations, even after the original traumatic event has been forgotten. The children of the islands don't know about the Mushroom War, but they've inherited the fear it created, the protective isolation it generated, the belief that the outside world is inherently dangerous. The Candy Kingdom, under Princess Bubblegum's rule, demonstrates authoritarian responses to collective vulnerability. Bubblegum created most of the Candy people, controls them through surveillance and behavioral modification, and justifies this control through protection. The Candy people are genuinely vulnerable. They're naive, easily hurt, sometimes literally made of candy that can be eaten. Bubblegum's authoritarianism emerges from accurate threat assessment, combined with unwillingness to allow her citizens to take risks or make their own decisions about safety. This is collective trauma, creating surveillance states. When danger is real and constant, societies often trade freedom for security. But Bubblegum's control also creates collective infantilization. The Candy people don't develop resilience, don't learn to handle threats themselves, don't build collective capacity for self-protection. When Bubblegum is unavailable, the Candy Kingdom often falls into chaos because the citizens have never learned collective self-governance. They've been protected from trauma, but also from growth, from agency, from the development of collective competence. This is the paradox of protective authoritarianism. It prevents acute harm while generating chronic dependency. Homeworld Gem Society shows collective trauma calcified into imperial expansion. The Gems' rigid caste system, their obsession with perfection, their treatment of off-color gems as defective, their colonial drive to consume planets, All of this represents a society organizing around fear of insufficiency, fear of chaos, fear of deviation from perfect order. While we don't see the trauma that originally generated this structure, the structure itself is traumatic, generating new wounds across generations of gems. This is how collective trauma perpetuates. The defenses one generation builds against trauma become the trauma the next generation experiences. The Homeworld Diamond's relationship to Pink's apparent shattering exemplifies collective grief, creating systemic harm. Yellow Diamond responds by becoming harder, stricter, more ruthless. Her trauma response is to eliminate vulnerability. Blue Diamond responds by becoming consumed by grief, unable to move forward, keeping everything as it was when Pink was alive. White Diamond responds by becoming even more distant and controlling, treating Pink's loss as evidence that her control wasn't total enough. None of them process the grief healthily, and their unprocessed grief shapes homeworld policy, affects thousands of gems, perpetuates cycles of harm. The corrupted gems represent collective trauma made physical. These aren't individuals who experience trauma. They're remnants of a massive, collective traumatic event. The diamonds attack that corrupted thousands of gems simultaneously. They exist in a state of permanent traumatic activation, unable to communicate or recognize others, driven only by distress and aggression. They're what trauma looks like when it's so overwhelming that it destroys identity and reduces beings to pure survival responses. The crystal gem's work, bubbling and eventually healing corrupted gems, is literally collective trauma recovery work, trying to restore identity and function to being shattered by shared catastrophe. Both shows explore how collective trauma affects social trust and cooperation. Beach City mostly maintains social cohesion because the crystal gems absorb the trauma of defense, allowing citizens to maintain normal social bonds. But when that protection fails, as during the Homeworld invasion, social bonds strain, people panic, turn on each other, lose the capacity for collective action. The land of Oo has very little large-scale social organization because collective trust is difficult when danger is constant and random. Kingdoms exist but are often at odds with each other, unable to build larger cooperative structures. The shows also demonstrate that collective healing requires collective effort and acknowledgement. Stephen can't heal all the corrupted gems alone. It requires the diamonds working together, using their combined powers to undo the harm they caused collectively. Finn can't restore humanity alone. He has to accept that the survival of human society might mean something different than restoring what was lost. Beach City's healing after Homeworld's invasion requires community members processing what happened together, supporting each other, not returning to denial, but building new shared understanding. Both shows suggest that collective trauma recovery is more difficult than individual recovery because it requires coordinating multiple people's healing processes, navigating political and social structures, overcoming entrenched defenses that serve some members while harming others. Princess Bubblegum's control serves her psychological needs while harming Candy People's development. Healing requires her to change, but also requires Candy People to develop new capacities, creating complex mutual dependency. Homeworld's hierarchy serves Gem's need for order while crushing anyone who doesn't fit. Healing requires systemic change that threatens everyone's sense of stability. The final truth both shows offer about collective trauma is that it's often invisible to those living inside it. Beach City residents don't think of themselves as traumatized. They just think this is how life is. Oo inhabitants don't see their world as post-apocalyptic. It's just their world. Homeworld gems don't recognize their society as traumatic. It's simply how gem civilization functions. Collective trauma is the water you swim in, so pervasive you don't notice it until you encounter an alternative. Finn's visit to the human islands shows him a different human trauma response, making Oo's response visible by contrast. Stephen's visits to Homeworld show him how gem trauma differs from crystal gem trauma. Seeing alternatives doesn't automatically generate healing, but it's often the necessary first step. Recognizing that your community's trauma responses are responses, not inevitabilities, not the only way societies can organize themselves in the face of threat. Trauma doesn't live only in minds and memories. It embeds itself in bodies, reshaping them, marking them, forcing itself into physical form. Both Adventure Time and Steven Universe literalize this truth through characters whose bodies manifest their psychological wounds, whose physical forms become documents of trauma that can't be hidden or ignored. Understanding how trauma becomes corporeal reveals the profound interconnection between psychological and physical experience, between mind and matter, between what we feel and what we become. The most obvious example is Simon's transformation into Ice King. The crown doesn't just affect Simon's mind, it transforms his body completely. His skin turns blue, his nose elongates, his proportions change. He grows a massive beard that covers much of his face. His body temperature drops so severely that he lives in permanent winter. This physical transformation is irreversible for most of the series, which means Simon's trauma is literally written on his body in ways he and everyone else must constantly confront. You can't meet Ice King without immediately seeing that something catastrophic has happened to him. His body is testimony to wounds that destroyed his original self. The crown functions almost like a parasite or tumor, a foreign object that hijacks the body's systems for its own purposes. It takes over Simon's biology, rewrites his neurology, makes his body dependent on its magic. When Simon removes the crown, he becomes desperately ill, physically unable to survive without the thing destroying his mind. This is trauma physiology made literal. The way trauma can become so integrated into our physical systems that removing it feels like dying, the way bodies adapt to traumatic circumstances until the adaptation itself becomes a form of entrapment. Finn's body carries visible marks of trauma accumulation. He loses his arm to the grass sword in escape from the citadel, a literal physical cost of his father's betrayal and the chaotic events that follow. The arm doesn't return. Instead, Finn adapts, learning to fight and function with one arm, eventually accepting a prosthetic. Later, his arm returns as part of a transformation, but the body remembers. The loss and return and loss again of Finn's arm represents the way trauma physically marks us, sometimes permanently, sometimes temporarily, but always meaningfully. His body is a record of everything he survived. The grass sword itself represents trauma that takes up residence in the body. It literally lives inside Finn's arm for a time, sprouting when threatened, defending him, but also acting independently of his will. This is an excellent metaphor for trauma responses that become physical. The hypervigilance that manifests as muscle tension, the fight or flight response that triggers without conscious decision, the way bodies react to perceived threats before minds can evaluate whether the threat is real. Finn's body protects him through the grass sword, but he can't always control when or how, just as trauma survivors often can't control when their bodies enter protective modes. Marceline's vampirism is another form of trauma physically manifesting. She was turned into a vampire as a child, bitten by the Vampire King during the apocalypse, when she was vulnerable and alone. Her vampirism gave her immortality and power, but it also marked her permanently as other, as different, as something that survives by consuming. When she chooses to give up her vampirism in stakes, her body struggles without it. She's physically dependent on this transformation that was forced on her as a child. The vampirism is simultaneously protection and wound. It kept her alive through centuries of danger, but also trapped her in a body that isn't fully her choice. The corrupted gems in Steven Universe present trauma-damaged bodies at their most extreme. Corruption doesn't just affect their minds, it completely transforms their physical forms. Gems who were once humanoid become massive monsters, lose speech, lose recognition of former friends, exist only in states of perpetual aggression and fear. Their bodies have been rewritten by trauma so severe that identity itself is destroyed. They're trapped in forms that reflect their psychological shattering, fragmented, barely functional, more wound than being. What makes corrupted gems particularly tragic is that their original forms still exist, potentially. The gem itself remains intact, even when the body manifests corruption. The form is the trauma response, the body expressing what the mind can't process. When the crystal gems eventually heal corruption, what they're doing is helping damaged minds release their traumatic grip on physical form, allowing the body to return to shape that matches identity rather than wound. This is what all trauma recovery involves, helping bodies release defensive postures held so long they've become permanent, helping physical form realign with selfhood rather than with survival. Steven's own body becomes a record of gem-human hybrid existence, a form that shouldn't exist according to gem biology, but does because Rose chose to give up her physical form. Steven ages when no gem should age, needs food and sleep when gems don't, experiences fatigue and illness unknown to pure gems. His body is an ongoing experiment in hybrid existence, and the stress of being something unprecedented manifests physically. He's not fully human or fully gem, and his body has to negotiate that ambiguity constantly, creating unique vulnerabilities and strengths. Steven's corruption in Steven Universe Future is his trauma finally overwhelming his body's ability to maintain form. When his mental health crisis becomes severe enough, his body stops being able to hold its shape. He transforms into a monster, massive, unstable, covered in spikes, unable to communicate. This is what extreme dissociation looks like when you're a shape-shifting being. The body gives up trying to maintain coherent form and instead expresses pure, traumatic overwhelm. Monster Steven isn't a separate entity. He's Steven's body manifesting what Steven's mind can no longer contain. The episode Change Your Mind earlier shows us how gems' bodies respond to psychological states. When Steven's gem is temporarily removed from his body, both halves struggle. Human Steven is dying without his gem. Gem Steven is defensive and aggressive without his human half. Neither half can function fully alone, suggesting that Steven's body, both parts, is designed for integration. The trauma of separation literally threatens to kill both halves. This is embodied knowledge. Steven's body knows it needs to be whole, even when circumstances try to force fragmentation. Pearl's body manifests her trauma through obsessive maintenance and control. She's described as defective by homeworld standards, made to serve rather than to lead. And she responds by making her body as perfect as possible. She's fastidious about cleanliness, controlled in movement, precise in combat. This is trauma response as physical discipline. If she can control her body perfectly, perhaps she can control the chaos trauma creates. But the control itself becomes compulsive. Another way, trauma marks the body through hypervigilance about presentation and behavior. Amethyst's body tells a different trauma story. She's smaller than she should be, overcooked in the kindergarten where she was made, and her insecurity about this manifests in how she shapeshifts constantly, tries on different forms, never seems comfortable in her default body. She shapeshifts more than other gems, as if searching for a form that feels right, that doesn't carry the evidence of being wrong. This is body dysmorphia created by trauma, the sense that your physical form is testimony to your inadequacy, that if you could just find the right shape, you'd stop feeling broken. Lapis Lazuli's wings carry her trauma visibly. They're cracked from being trapped in a mirror for thousands of years, and even after being freed, the cracks remain. She can still fly, still function, but her wings are permanently marked by her imprisonment. The cracks are beautiful in their own way. They catch light differently, create patterns that wouldn't exist in undamaged wings, but they're also evidence of harm she endured. Many trauma survivors relate to this, physical markers of trauma that become part of identity, that tell stories about survival even as they testify to wounds. Both shows demonstrate that bodies in pain develop their own logic, their own priorities that bypass conscious decision-making. When Finn's body goes into fight mode, he acts before thinking. When Stephen's body starts to corrupt, his conscious mind can't stop it. When corrupted gems attack, they're not making choices. Their bodies are stuck in permanent fight-flight response. This is what trauma physiology does. It creates body-level responses that operate faster than thought, that take control when they perceive threat, that were designed to save you from immediate danger, but that can't always distinguish between real and remembered threats. The shows also explore how healing bodies requires more than just deciding to feel better. Simon can't just choose to not be Ice King. His body is physically dependent on the crown's magic. Corrupted gems can't just choose to return to their original forms. Their bodies are locked in traumatic expression. Stephen can't just calm down and return to normal from his corrupted state. His body is manifesting trauma too deep for willpower to override. Healing requires intervention, magical healing for Simon. The diamond's combined power for corrupted gems, physical embrace, and sustained love for Stephen's corruption. Bodies in trauma need external help to release what they're holding. The physical manifestations of trauma in both shows refuse the fantasy that trauma is just mental, just something you can think or feel your way through. When trauma rewrites your body, when it changes your physical form, when it creates chronic pain or defensive postures or altered states, healing requires addressing the body directly. Stephen learns this in therapy with Dr. Maheswaran. His mental health crisis has physical components that need physical intervention. He needs to learn to breathe differently, to notice physical warning signs of escalation, to develop body-based calming techniques. Healing trauma means healing bodies, not just minds. Ultimately, both shows teach us that bodies are honest in ways minds aren't. Minds can deny, rationalize, minimize trauma. Bodies can't lie. When Simon's body turns blue and cold, it's telling the truth about what the crown is doing to him, even when his mind loses the capacity to understand. When Stephen's body transforms into a monster, it's telling the truth about how severe his trauma has become, even when he's been denying the severity to himself and others. Bodies remember what minds forget, carry what consciousness can't bear, and manifest what words can't express. Listening to bodies, attending to their testimony, taking seriously their messages about stored trauma. This is essential healing work that both shows model through characters whose bodies literally cannot hide their wounds. The final stage of trauma healing isn't forgetting what happened or transcending it into irrelevance. It's integration, carrying traumatic experience as part of your story while not letting it be your only story. Holding wounds alongside growth, acknowledging damage while insisting on capacity for joy, meaning, and connection. Both shows conclude by showing characters who have integrated their trauma, moving forward into futures shaped but not entirely determined by their pasts. Understanding this integration reveals what successful healing actually looks like beyond the fantasy of complete restoration. Simon's ending demonstrates integration at its most bittersweet. He has his sanity back, but has lost 900 years, has lost Betty, exists as a historical artifact in a world that moved on without him. He could be consumed by these losses, could define himself entirely through what he's lost, and can never recover. Instead, the later content shows him gradually building new life, developing new relationships, finding new purposes, existing in the present rather than being trapped in grief for the past. He hasn't forgotten Betty or his lost centuries. He carries them as part of his story, but he's allowing new story to develop alongside the old. This is integration. Simon is both the man who lost everything and the man building something new. He's the antiquarian from before the Mushroom War, and the survivor of 900 years of madness, and the person existing in Oo's present. These identities don't contradict each other. They layer, creating complexity and depth. When he speaks about Betty, it's with genuine grief, but the grief doesn't prevent him from engaging with his current life. He's learned to hold multiple truths simultaneously. Betty is gone, that loss is permanent and painful, and he can still find moments of meaning in his present existence. Marceline's integration spans 1,000 years of practice. By series' end, she's someone who carries extraordinary grief and trauma while also being capable of joy, creativity, love, and connection. She doesn't pretend her mother's death doesn't matter, or that losing Simon to the crown was easy. Those wounds remain real, but she's built a life that includes music, friendship, romantic love, community. She's integrated centuries of loss into an identity that's more than her wounds. She's the trauma survivor and the accomplished musician and the loyal friend and the girlfriend learning to be vulnerable again. Her relationship with Princess Bubblegum represents integrated intimacy, both bringing their full complicated histories to the relationship, both acknowledging how their past hurt each other, both choosing to try again while holding realistic awareness of their patterns and difficulties. This isn't fairy tale romance that erases problems. It's mature relationship that integrates awareness of each person's damage while choosing connection anyway. They're not healed perfectly before loving each other. They're healing while loving each other, letting the relationship be part of healing rather than waiting for healing to be complete before allowing relationship. Finn's ending shows integration through his choice to continue adventuring while maintaining a more balanced life. He hasn't given up heroism entirely. It remains part of who he is, part of his identity. But it's not his only identity anymore. He has relationships, contemplative practices, interests beyond constant action. He's integrated his need to help people with his need for rest and reflection. He's held onto his heroic values, courage, compassion, willingness to act against injustice, while releasing the compulsive quality his heroism once had. His acceptance that he's not the last human, but also not part of a thriving human community, represents another integration. He's released the pressure to single-handedly preserve or represent humanity, while acknowledging that his humanness matters to him, shapes how he relates to Oo. He's both uniquely human in a non-human world and just Finn, not primarily defined by his species. He carries the weight of humanity's near extinction, while not letting that weight crush his present existence. Steven's ending in Steven Universe Future explicitly addresses integration. He's going on a road trip, leaving Beach City, exploring who he might be in other contexts. This is integration in process rather than integration achieved. He's taking the work of integration with him, continuing to process and grow while moving forward. He hasn't resolved all his trauma, hasn't completed therapy, hasn't achieved some final healed state. He's someone actively engaged in ongoing healing while also living his life. And the show's ending acknowledges this is what real healing looks like: ongoing process rather than achieved destination. His goodbyes to the crystal gems show integration of his anger and love, his hurt and gratitude. He tells them honestly that they failed him in some ways, that he's still processing their choices, that he's not just grateful for everything they did, but he also expresses love, acknowledges their genuine care, maintains connection despite the complicated history. This is integrated relationship, holding both injury and care, both resentment and love, both criticism and appreciation. He's not pretending everything was perfect, but he's also not letting the imperfections sever connection. The crystal gem's own integration involves accepting that they damaged Stephen while loving him, that they failed in some responsibilities while succeeding in others, that they were imperfect guardians who nonetheless kept him alive and eventually supported his healing. Pearl integrates her grief for Rose with her care for Stephen, no longer seeing Stephen only through Rose, but also not pretending Rose doesn't matter. Garnet integrates her future vision with present moment presence, using foresight when helpful, but not being controlled by it. Amethyst integrates her insecurity with growing confidence, acknowledging damage while celebrating growth. Princess Bubblegum's integration involves accepting that she can't control everything, that her subjects need autonomy, even if autonomy includes risk, that relationships require vulnerability that feels dangerous. She doesn't become permissive or stop caring about safety. She integrates awareness that safety through control is illusory, with gradual willingness to trust others' capability. She remains who she is: analytical, strategic, deeply protective, while expanding to include flexibility and trust she previously lacked. The show's depiction of corrupted gems being healed illustrates integration at the collective level. The healed gems don't return unchanged. They've experienced thousands of years of corruption, of being mindless monsters, of being bubbled and stored. But they're being welcomed back, helped to reintegrate into gem society, supported in processing what happened to them. This is community-level integration, acknowledging massive trauma, providing support for recovery, making space for survivors to rebuild identity while carrying their experiences. Both shows refuse the fantasy that integration means happiness, constant or uncomplicated. Integrated characters still have bad days, still get triggered, still struggle with their histories. Marceline still grieves Simon and her mother. Stephen still has nightmares. Finn still processes his father's rejection. Pearl still misses Rose. But these struggles exist alongside other experiences: joy, connection, purpose, growth. Integration doesn't eliminate suffering. It creates capacity to experience suffering alongside other emotions, to hold pain without being consumed by it. The shows also demonstrate that integration requires community. No character integrates their trauma in isolation. They heal through relationship, through witness, through others' support and challenge and presence. Simon needs Marceline's witness. Stephen needs his support system's acknowledgement and embrace. Finn needs Jake's steady companionship. Pearl needs the other Crystal Gem's patient presence. Integration happens in the space between people, in relationships that can hold both woundedness and capability, both struggle and strength. Both shows emphasize that integration allows forward movement that forgetting doesn't. If you forget or suppress trauma, it controls you unconsciously, erupting in triggers and defensive patterns you don't understand. If you integrate trauma, if you acknowledge it, process it, incorporate it consciously into your ongoing story, you can make real choices about your future. You're responding to present reality rather than constantly reacting to past wounds. Integration creates agency that suppression and avoidance prevent. The characters who successfully integrate their trauma model what psychologists call post-traumatic growth. The development of new strengths, deeper relationships, expanded capacity for meaning, precisely because of confronting trauma. Marceline's capacity for loyalty and deep feeling comes partly from her losses. Finn's compassion comes partly from his own suffering. Stephen's insight into others comes partly from processing his own complexity. Pearl's teaching ability comes partly from her own need to learn and grow. Their traumas didn't make them better. Trauma isn't redemptive in itself, but their work to process and integrate trauma developed capacities that enrich their lives and relationships. The show's conclusions acknowledge that integration is never final. Life continues. New challenges emerge. Old wounds sometimes reopen. But integrated characters have developed tools for meeting challenges. They have support systems, coping strategies, self-awareness, and capacity for resilience that they didn't have before. They're not invulnerable, but they're more prepared. They're not undamaged, but they're capable of living fully despite damage. They're not healed perfectly, but they're healing progressively. The ultimate message both shows offer about integration is that it allows for whole lives rather than half lives. Trauma can make people feel like they're only partially alive, going through motions, unable to feel fully, disconnected from genuine experience. Integration restores full aliveness, capacity to feel deeply, to connect meaningfully, to engage with life's complexities without being overwhelmed. The characters who achieve integration demonstrate that trauma's aftermath can include not just survival, but genuine flourishing, not by denying what happened, but by refusing to let what happened be the only thing that defines them. Both Adventure Time and Steven Universe conclude by showing us characters who have done the difficult work of integration, who carry their wounds while building lives that matter, who remember their traumas while insisting on futures that include more than trauma. They show us that healing is possible not as erasure of damage, but as expansion of identity, to include damage alongside growth, loss alongside gain, suffering alongside joy. They teach us that moving forward doesn't require forgetting. It requires integrating, holding the fullness of our experience, and choosing to continue building meaning and connection despite everything we've survived. This is trauma healing's real promise, not restoration to some imaginary pre-traumatic innocence, but development of capacity to live fully, love deeply, and continue growing precisely because we've confronted and integrated the worst things that happened to us.